Good morning, I'm Jon Collins from the Register, and we're here to talk about unlocking the business value of your information, which is exactly what it says on the slide in front of me, so it better be right. Now, a wise man once said to me that value equals benefits minus costs. So we're going to be covering the benefits, we're going to be covering the costs, and hopefully at the end of it we'll have a picture of whether or not that value can be achieved in all of your organisations, whether they're large, small, or, whether it's just you doing this stuff out there. So in order to help me answer that question, or actually to answer that question, because I won't be doing it, I've got Chris Smyth, who's a consultant at Parity Solutions.
Good morning.
Morning, Chris. And Tony Locke, a regular from Freeform Dynamics. Good morning, Tony.
Good morning, John.
And also dialing in from the sunny north, I hope it's sunny up there, Tom, we've got Tom Zebedee, who's Head of Architecture at Ofsted. So, hello, Tom.
Oh, hi, everybody. It is just the sun's just beginning to shine up here.
Fantastic. So, you might think that we're here to talk about the business value of information, but one thing that all of our guests share is a deep love of tropical fish, I understand. Chris keeps them. Tom has got a goldfish, which goes deeply into the nature of that, and Tony has killed them. So we're all up for tropical fish. So any questions that you have about business intelligence, about getting value of information at any size of whatever database you're trying to do it, or guppies, we are here to answer all of your questions this morning. But otherwise, very much this is going to be about what the impact is of getting your information better. What do you need to think about when you're trying to manage information? Where do you start? And what's realistic for you to do? So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Tony, so you can tell us all about the context within which we should be answering these questions.
Thanks a lot, John. Good morning, everybody. As many of you will know, we recently ran a survey with the readers of the Register to ask them, essentially, what's going on in their organisations, what pressures are they under, what are they finding, what are the things that people can do better. And the first few slides I'd like to go through are just going through some of the feedback we've got from the audience. So on the first slide here, as we can see, basically nothing too surprising in terms of what are the imperatives inside public sector organisations today. Strangely, the number one issue was costs. Reducing operating costs. Now, that struck me as being incredibly surprising. I didn't think anybody was really looking after budgets that tightly these days. But apparently they are, and as we can see, more than 60% of people have that, very, very significant push to manage costs effectively.
If I could ask a question here, what's the difference between operating costs and capital expenditure on this one?
Well, that's one probably better pitched at an accountant, of whom I'm not one of that community. But in terms of the questions as we asked them of the audience, reducing operating costs were essentially keeping the money that's spent, day by day, keeping things working, and reducing capital expenditure tends to be buying new things, taking money out of capital accounts. Now, in many organisations, in the public sector and in the private sector, there's not always quite a distinct distinction between capital expenditure and revenue expenditure, operating costs and capital costs. That's something that certainly accountants like to focus on, and quite often IT vendors like to focus on, but in the real world it may or may not be an issue for many organisations. For some it absolutely is, but for many really the focus is around managing costs effectively. That's what it boils down to.
But that means we're not seeing that much on the two bottom things here, which is actually making a better world.
Well, you can say that we're not seeing too much, but as you can see, we're still up to 40% almost, having either significant pushes or big imperatives to actually make more of the information that they have inside their organisations, get better information management and unlock more value from the data that they store. So that's still there, despite the fact that people want to control costs, and that's pretty much a reflection of society as a whole at the moment.
And we'll see later on as well that we try and use the business intelligence by utilising current equipment, current hardware. So it's not necessarily about bringing in more hardware, it's trying to utilise current technologies that they have.
Making the most of what you've got.
That's right, and that'll come out later on in our discussions.
So I'm keen to bring in Tom as early as possible, as much to check that the link's working okay as anything, but also, Tom, this is a general picture of organisations across the public sector. How does it fit with your experience at Ofsted?
I think it's. I think it reflects our experience relatively well. I think if we look at it in terms of benefits, our focus would be on the bottom two, really, around improving information management and unlocking more value from the information that we hold, both internally and externally. I think in terms of operating costs and reduction in operating costs, we're in a place where we're just beginning to use, a sort of business intelligence approach to corporate information. So we need quite a lot of people to help us do that, both from the from the specialist sector as well as internally. So I don't think that's a particular focus for us. We'd like to be able to do it, but we think it's probably a little bit too early for us to have got ourselves to a mature place with our, if you like, our warehouse, which allows us to drive out costs from within the organisation. So I'm probably more interested in the bottom two, because we can benefit our customer as well as benefit colleagues internally.
And just while you're there, Tom, who is your customer in this? Who are you needing to achieve? However you phrase it, is it outcomes? The KPIs? Who actually cares the most?
Well, it's a kind of mixed picture, really. I think in the past we would have said it's our key customers are probably ministers, informing policy and that line of our business. But increasingly, our customers are parents with children looking for services, and also looking to compare services across sectors and across geographical areas. So increasingly, the information which we're interested in internally is information which interests people outside of Ofsted.
Okay, thank you. And turning back to Tony then, moving on to the next slide.
Just before we do, Tom's made a couple of really important points there.
Turning back to the last slide.
The first one being that there's a lot of attention and pressure to manage costs more effectively, but essentially a lot of IT organisations have been under that pressure for many years now. You could argue, going back almost to year 2K, that there's been a lot of focus on IT spend to make sure that there wasn't waste inside the organisation. So a lot of the potential for cost control has really been exploited already. So moving on to the real value generation side is something that's very, very important for organisations, but one that's maybe not quite appreciated as well, because it's less immediate and has less obvious impact in terms of either the bottom line or the top line, and certainly not the correlation between the two. But as you say, moving on, when we asked the audience exactly how do you rate your organisation's current capabilities in different areas, as we can see, when it comes to the sort of regulatory reporting, the governance reporting that Tom mentioned was previously a really big focus of attention for them. The vast majority of organisations are comfortable that they've got a pretty good grip on that. But as we move down through the list in terms of providing better information for the line management or for the organisation's management to decide the way forward, for line managers underneath that to actually control the organisation day by day, and right down to serving the information needs of the broader workforce, things do not seem to be quite so well. Organisations are not quite as comfortable that they've got the capabilities they need to service those new requirements, or they're not new requirements, but they're perhaps requirements that there's becoming more pressure on.
I'm going to bring in, it's not so much a question as a statement from Martin, who's come in and said, in our public sector organisation, the driver is achieving more with fewer resources, so that fits very much from the previous slide. But equally, this is well, I'll use his words. To do this, we aim to maximise our potential, which is a tagline, and the word empowerment. So empowerment at all levels, which fits very much with what you're saying there.
And as we can see, people are much less comfortable that they've got the capabilities already to meet that lower level being the wrong phrase to use, but meeting the needs of the workforce as a whole. People just don't have the tools and the processes and the knowledge there to do that well yet, or they're certainly not comfortable that they can. But as you can see, there is certainly an increasing pressure to do so.
And just as a matter of interest, Tom, is this empowerment question one that resonates with Ofsted?
I think so, yeah. I mean, we're keen to make information more available to people, and we're keen to ensure that the information meets their needs. So we've coupled our business intelligence solution with some lightweight processes which allow people to, request different types of reports and all that kind of stuff. So we've tried to make what's available or what's increasingly available in the warehouse available to people across the organisation. So yeah, I think it is about making stuff more accessible to people.
And also bringing my experience as well in this is that you are trying to give data out to various audiences, from high up management who tend to work up with rolled up, simplified view of data down to the lower levels, as we're calling it, which require the detailed level. So the business intelligence world is trying to deal with that scope of reporting.
I mean, picking up on those points and maybe drilling down into one specific area, more of the performance management, which, as I understand it, is getting into the nitty-gritty of what all of this means. Is that a fair statement, Tony?
It certainly seems to be, as we see from the next slide here, when we asked organisations looking at the performance management and the performance monitoring side of things, are you seeing any of the particular trends here? If we just focus on the top half of the screen around monitoring, we can see that essentially there is pressure for organisations in the public sector not only to monitor their performance more broadly, i.e. across a greater range of areas and reporting back to whoever they have to report to, but also something that's come through both from the figures themselves and also from some of the comments that the readership gave us are that it's people need more detail, so they need to report both more broadly, in more detail, certainly more frequently. That's something that cropped up time and time again, that the demand is no longer just to do a quarterly or a 6-monthly, maybe even an annual report on certain indices, but to come at it much more frequently, as well as potentially having more of an ad hoc requirement for reporting that wasn't previously in the toolkit at all.
Are you seeing this as an increased pressure?
Yes, I think that business intelligence is all about making your data kind of opening it up and allowing you to play around with it and provide an infrastructure where you can do more of the ad hoc reporting, but do it in such a way that it's from a controlled environment rather than just somebody throwing together things like spreadsheets. And it provides that control environment and allows you to then also put the governance on to how to monitor, to put questions into the kind of BI world that help you monitor your performance with key metrics, performance indicators, scorecards, dashboards. So it's a kind of a framework that allow you to put this into practice.
But it's the old, you can't measure, you can't manage.
Absolutely.
Adage.
And to go on to that, the bottom half of the screen here says, well, OK, if you're measuring what you're doing, how does that compare with other entities? So the whole benchmarking side of things. And we know that politicians in particular have a lot of interest in doing benchmarking, however appropriate or inappropriate it might be. But we can see here that there's certainly a degree of pressure for public sector organisations to benchmark themselves against similar types of entity. Much less pressure for them to benchmark themselves against completely dissimilar public sector organisations, and even less pressure to do so against private sector entities.
It's interesting question here, Tom, because you're a kind of a benchmarking organisation ultimately for measuring. You can tell me if I'm wrong on that, but how do you actually measure your own ability to deliver services?
Well, that's kind of measured against other organisations, in terms of how much our services cost to deliver, how much our IT costs to deliver. So we have a we have a view across government and across similar types of organisations, both in the DFE family, if you like, and also in wider government. So and then we have our own internal performance management perspective, which is, how can we improve in what we do and, reduce the cost, reduce the financial costs of bits of work that we do and stuff like that. But, I think this slide's really interesting because, I'm seeing a real change in terms of focus for customers in the other half of my job, where my teams deliver information and technical architecture to support software development and application projects. Increasingly, data is now an upfront requirement, whereas in the past it might have been seen as a bit more of an add-on. So there's definitely a greater expectation amongst customers that they want the ability to monitor what it is they're doing and the changes that they've made.
It's not rocket science, is it? I mean, in the old days we talked about delivering computer systems, and they become the thing, and actually this is about delivering information, which makes more sense as a thing, wouldn't you say, Chris?
I would think so. I think that's what we're dealing
But
with.
yeah,
Yes.
you're in this job, aren't you? So
I've got to say yes to that.
it's an unfair question, or a very fair question, I should say. So, Tony, reality check time?
Yep. And again, we go back to the things that the readers have told us. And as we can see from this slide, when we ask the question, how good a shape are you basically in to meet these demands? As you can see, there's quite an interesting split here between the two shades of green on the left-hand side and the bright red and the orange on the disagree side of the page there. So there's maybe one organisation in three think they're fairly well positioned to actually meet these increased demands for reporting generally, and twice as many say, no, we're not, which again reflects pretty much the sort of information that we've got from the private sector as well as the public sector. It's not just something that's purely constrained.
So the mind is willing, but the body is weak.
There's a recognition that there's more that could be done. But we've obviously got to move forward to meet that requirement, and you can't do this overnight. It takes time. It takes training, and it isn't just a technology question again. You can put the greatest tools in the world in front of everybody, but unless they have a good idea of the right questions to ask and where's the data and some of the things that we'll be getting back to a little bit later, then it's really hard to improve things. Things very rarely change overnight. Even with the best will in the world, they can't change overnight.
But in your experience, Chris, do people get that there's real potential here and there's stuff to be done, or are you banging on?
I found that they do get the point, and they, whenever you show people this, they think this is really good, but it is difficult for them to buy in, and that's part of the message we'll give later on. They have to buy into it and find a way of making that happen. So hopefully with pressures of day-to-day work, brings out that need to provide these higher level analytics and views of their business to improve themselves. So very much find that they get it. Again, as you said, the mind's willing, perhaps the body is a bit behind.
And if we move on from just that top level bar there and look at, well, okay, what's the reality check? We can see that, yep, sure enough, that pressure and finding new money to do things with, it's really difficult. There's very few organisations there that say it's very easy. You can see there's the green bars on the left-hand side are quite small, but there's still money there to be had where people recognise the value that comes from it. But as you move down to the bottom of the screen, you can see that everybody does recognise that, frankly, there's far more potential in the tools that they already have that they're not exploiting. Very few organisations, again, roughly 1 in 5, say they're doing really well with what they've got, that they're making the most of what they have, whereas twice as many say, no, we know we could do better. We know we could exploit the tools that we're already in our possession to get more of this information out, but how do we get there?
Well, let's have a look at some of those tools. Here you go, Tony. Talk us through this one.
And again, perhaps no surprise, right at the top, everybody's business information tool of choice, unless you are a real BI guru, data analytics guru, is still the spreadsheet. Probably has been ever since I was a boy in IT. I remember one of my colleagues when I was a real IT manager who actually used the spreadsheet for doing both combined heat and power plant design analysis, as well as working out how much and which volumes of electricity to sell back to the grid before that was even something that was really considered. So people have been using spreadsheet technology for a long time to do lots of very complicated analysis that perhaps the guys that originally created the software never had in mind, but it is undoubtedly the tool of choice today. And as we can see, there's quite a lot of potential in there, a recognition that there's lots of potential to use the technologies, both on the spreadsheet side, on the collaboration side, all the way down to the specialist data analytics. But if we flip to the right-hand side of the chart, and how well are you actually exploiting that? Back to the last slide again, there's a recognition that, frankly, we could do far, far more with the tools that we have in place already than we are doing. The grey bars in almost all cases are bigger than the dark green bars on the left.
It sounds to me, Chris, like you've got your work cut out. So.
Yes, I have, but again, in my experience, I found that when you provide a spreadsheet solution, even if you've got some clever BI technology behind it, then it's perceived familiar and they understand it, and the message gets across straight away. because they're comfortable with that environment. And many times I've used pivot tables to provide information, but you remove all the BI-ness about it and just present them with a nice table of data, and they're comfortable with that.
I was going to say, because to me, a spreadsheet's like a little office tool thing that you kind of use to add up a few numbers, and BI is this whopping great big people in white lab coats.
It doesn't have to be that. No, it's not that at all.
I think the important thing here is about it's working out answers and getting information from sources of data. And comfort is a really important point. People will use tools that they're comfortable with, whereas they'll be really reluctant and take a fair amount of persuasion to use things that make them uncomfortable. And so if people are happy using spreadsheets and the spreadsheets have that capability, then exploit it. If you need to go beyond the capabilities of the spreadsheet, then there are tools available for it. But the people who want to do that will tend to be, pretty specific in that area anyway, so they're more likely to be comfortable with those additional tools anyway.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Tom now, who's going to tell us all about Ofsted. But first, Tom, maybe be interesting to reflect back onto this chart and say, does this fit again with your experience of the kinds of tools that are in place? And
yeah, it does. And, I was just quite interested in Tony's last comment there, which was around the comfort for people. And certainly our experience has been that people do stick with the tools that they are comfortable with, and we think that the information and data which is available from our BI solution could replace much of what is being developed through, point-based MI solutions out in our business or spreadsheets on people's desktops and stuff like that. And we're still trying to work around, how do we exploit that actually, because that's a helpful thing for us to know really, So we're doing our best to make data available in SharePoint solutions in a way which allows it to be used by people within those tools on their desktops. So here's something you can use in Excel. It's embryonic, but it's kind of something we're quite interested in, because moving people towards using the data which is held in our BI solution might not involve them using the BI solution, which is kind of a little bit easier for them to get their heads around. Mm-hmm. But were you going to move me on, John?
So, well, yeah, Just for clarity, you said MI. Is that management information?
Yeah, sorry.
Is that the old stuff?
Yeah, it's the old operational. So how many of what have we done today?
Right,
as opposed to what impact have we made, or where are we going towards our targets over time? Which is kind of what we use our BI
tactical metrics. And so take us through it from the top then, Tom. So how has Ofsted developed its BI strategy, and what experience has that brought to you?
Yeah, well, Ofsted is an organisation which has grown in the remits that it regulates and inspects over the years. It started out as doing the end-to-end inspection of schools, and it took that remit on from local authorities and other parts of government which have been doing it for well over 100 years. So it had an in-house provision to inspect a large number of schools across the country. Then that was outsourced for the most part to inspection service partners who we work with. Mm-hmm. And in the early, just after the millennium, Ofsted then took on childcare regulations, so childminders and things like that. And so as a result of that, we ended up with two in-house line of business systems which produce both the work for us to do and track the work and kind of make sure that we do the right things in the right order, but at the same time produced a range of management information for us about what it was we were doing and who was doing it and all that kind of stuff. So we still have those two line of business systems within Ofsted at the minute, but Ofsted itself has now moved to a position where really we need to take a corporate view of what we're doing. We can't just have a particular schools-based view of the world or an early years-based view of the world. And we also do learning and skills as well, which is colleges and FE colleges. So our driver around our information strategy and our BI strategy is to consolidate the information and intelligence that we have within those line of business systems, bring them together into one place where we can reliably compare performance across the various remits that we look at, and ensure that from the top of the shop there's one view of how Ofsted's performing. So our strategy is really driven out of the need to move ourselves to one view of how Ofsted works, rather than a kind of rather federal view based on the various remits.
I get the impression as well that what you had in the past was more of a kind of rear view mirror of what had happened, as opposed to necessarily giving you the view of what needed to happen.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm not so sure that's necessarily a desperately relevant argument within Ofsted. It's definitely rear view, but our strategy canvas within Ofsted is kind of quite long term. We tend to work in government cycles, although change does come to the organisation pretty regularly and rapidly. But they won't ask us to do universities tomorrow, and they may never ask us to do universities. Mm-hmm. But I think it's fair to say it's rear view, but I don't think that's necessarily the strongest driver for change for us. It's much more around what's our consolidated view of what's happening.
Right. So it's being able to provide that. Almost the management portal across all educational establishments and delivery. And how does that fit in with? I'm a parent. I've got kids, and I know these things are changing. Every time we have a new government, it seems to have there's new ways of presenting information and new metrics that are requested, and so on and so forth. How much of that is driving your strategy?
That's currently driving the strategy more and more. For us, we have to be able to get key data onto the internet, make it available to people. We're in competition with sites like Schooloscope and things like that, which are using our data and presenting it in ways which we're not. Let's just put it like that. So we have an increasing number of consumers out there who aren't policymakers and aren't ministers and aren't necessarily the department. They're not heads either. They're just people who are interested in what's going on around them from a fairly parochial family perspective of where's the best place to send my children to school, or where's the best place I can find a childminder. And that's presenting new challenges for us, and I think will shape our strategy as we go forward, because we're having to look really carefully at the data that's in our systems now and be really comfortable that we want to share it with people. It's transformed many times from the point where it's collected in a classroom to the point where it's presented on a system on the internet. So it's beginning to, I think, move us further and further towards the BI solution, because that's somewhere where we've got much greater capability to look at a piece of data and say, does this make sense for us? So I think our strategy is increasingly towards using our BI solution more and more, and I don't see any developments over the next 12 to 18 months going forward without a substantial BI element within them.
Mm-hmm. Well, ultimately you're a BI organisation, I guess. So tell us a bit more about how ICT's fitted into all of that.
Yeah.
Have you had to rip and replace, or over to you?
Well, we've generally, like many public sector organisations, I think we would love to buy, but we inevitably end up building. We have, to a certain extent, with our BI solution, we have bought in that we've gone for a Microsoft solution. But we're still heavily reliant on business objects in our, if you like, the rear view mirror space. So it's hugely valuable to us in terms of working out where we've been, how many things what we've done. And our strategy over the next I think 12 to 18 months is going to be to try and increase the role of our business intelligence solution to replace what people might be trying to use the rear view mirror for. So we've gone for a data warehouse which draws information out of our three key line of business systems and places that in an environment which we can then query through cubes and all that kind of stuff, which I don't know very much about, but I have good people who can help me in that.
Yeah, me neither. So
I shall keep that out of my discussions as well.
I cut you off. Go on, carry on.
We're increasingly relying on that business intelligence solution to deliver the really key information for the organisation.
Excellent. So, anything more I should ask you at this point, or?
No, I think we've kind of covered it as we've gone along. I think the key thing that I'm saying now this year that I probably wouldn't have said last year is just how the priority that's given to what we call it our corporate data warehouse, which is our BI solution. The priority which is now given to corporate data warehouse development, corporate data repository developments, and the alignment between the development of what's held in that repository and changes, for instance, to our frameworks. So you will have heard the Chief Inspector talking over the last 2 or 3 months about, satisfactory is not good enough. And we're going to move to a different nomenclature for how we're going to talk about schools that would have been satisfactory in the past but are no longer satisfactory. So now we're doing the work in our line of business systems to, if you like, capture those judgments and make sense of them. But we're also in parallel, and this is the really kind of exciting and different bit over the last few years, in parallel we're amending our business intelligence solution as well to ensure that as soon as that change happens, we can report on that and we can begin to use that data to shape, what else do we need to do to make sure that we continue to have an impact in this space. So I think the two things are coming much more closely together and probably quicker than I thought. Mm-hmm. So that's it's just, and I think that must say something about the value and benefit in moving down this approach.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. So we're going to hand over to Chris now. Okay. In terms of what are the kinds of things that people need to do to get to a situation where they're actually using information better, getting more value out of it, and so on and so forth. Before we do, I've got again, it's not a question, it's a statement from one of our readers out there. It said, "I'm surprised you haven't mentioned SQL and corporate well-organised data." Well, now we have. But if that's something that you can build into what you're going to be talking
Sure.
about, Chris, as you go along. And there's some other questions there about implementation costs and so on and so forth, which I think we'll pick up as we move forward. So over to you, Chris.
Okay.
Where should we start?
I suppose the first thing to start is what factors, the critical factors, do you use to deliver a successful solution? And I've kind of highlighted them into 3 areas, and it's somewhat we've repeated this before. I think the most important aspect of this is understanding your business data, and that goes down to the governance of the data, what it means, what the security levels are. What is it you got? Is it sufficient to meet your needs? Is something missing? That's such an important part of the whole process. It's the information that the owner knows. It's no tool or no consultant or anything can come in and add that. That's so important that you understand what you've got. Second thing, of course, is, well, what are you trying to do with it? Where you're going? What are your pressures on reporting? Again, with governance, security, legislation. How do you then realise that data? So again, you have to kind of know, not necessarily the end point, but you need to know your direction you need to go down to, where you're driving to. And I guess the third thing is also then understanding what environment you currently work in. No point in bringing in whole new technologies, which everybody has to learn. It may work, but it might be very difficult to implement that. So you very much have to say, well, what have we got? Is there stuff we have now that we can actually use with this BI view into it? And then move down the path of, yes, maybe putting in bigger data warehouses over time, but as you get more confident with it, as you grow the need for the use of BI, that becomes kind of self-justifying.
You say understand the value of the data. Let's take it right back to that.
Sure.
Every organisation's got a million things it could be collecting at any moment in time. It's not as easy as just saying, understand it. Where on earth do you ask people what data have you got? Or
yes, you do ask people, but you have to say, okay, well, what are our key business drivers? What is it that's important? Yes, you have all the detail, but it's really above that. It's saying, okay, what does our data tell us? Have we got a list of schools and how they've been looked after? What is it that's driving our business? And what does that mean as a business value? It isn't about understanding, okay, that's the name of a school. it's understanding what does that as a business concept mean. So really it's putting the business layer onto your operational data. You already have in place hopefully systems that are driving your day-to-day business, your reactive type mode. This is now putting your business value onto what your data is. So you can ask your business questions. How can we monitor what we're doing? How do we become better? On top of hopefully what we're doing very well, which is our day-to-day. Maybe you're not as well. But
do you arrive at a point where, I mean, given that a lot of organisations have been around for more than 50 years, and therefore a lot of organisations will have been managing various types of information for at least 40 years, do you arrive at a point where you say, well, I know you've been collating that particular data for the past 20 years, but it's not actually relevant to the business, just stop? Just that information isn't going to be useful to you moving forward?
Yes, you kind of do that in a way, though, and Tom mentioned the data warehouse concept. Now, the point about the data warehouse is you do create this store of meaningful data that adds value to the process of BI, that forms a source of authority of data. So it becomes the centre point of any BI solution, is that you have this confidence with your data, the data's understood, it's brought together in a meaningful way. And that can either be done straight from operational systems, or it provides a buffer zone where you can manipulate your operational data into that authoritative source of data. That's a key point about how you implement it, is to get that authority data that people have confidence with and then can use going forward in whatever reporting method they need to expose as required.
But it has brought up a couple of really important points. The first of which is we know, again, from the readership, when they've told us over many, many instances, not just the recent surveys on business information, most organisations don't have a coherent picture of what data they have. So the other thing they have are quite often that they've got lots of siloed data pools that may be holding similar data, but it's not quite the same. It's not reconciled anywhere, so you've got conflicts to get over. You've got data ownership issues to get over. Who can actually look at this? Who can't look at it? Who do I not want to look at it? And beyond that, it's the whole process of, is there actually some data that we should be collecting, the opposite of the question you asked, that we're not? That's something that more recently people have begun to see. Are they certainly collecting information that they're probably never going to exploit? Almost certainly, yes. Of course, the big data concept would have you believe that all data is inherently incredibly valuable, even if it's only 1 bit out of every gigabyte. But again, it's a matter of balance. People don't know what they've got. They don't know how it can be exploited, and that's really the starting point. You're getting that understanding, that big picture understanding of what's important.
And Tom, if I might ask, this question of authoritative, how did you tackle that at Ofsted? How did you decide what was authoritative and what wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, I picked up a couple of things from that whole piece there, but data governance is really, really important, and I don't think we've got an exemplar answer really. I mean, I think the thing that I would say is that you just need to have a conversation about your data, and sometimes those conversations do go on for a very long time. There's a concept of a provider in Ofsted, which could be a school, could be a childcare provider, but what it means to a particular individual is often very different to what it means to another particular individual. So we definitely struggle with that on a day-to-day basis. Who's in charge of what this piece of data means, and who's in charge of how we will use it going forward. We've now got a CDR governance board with really senior people in it, in the organisation, who sit on that board, and they, if you like, give the authority to board members and other people, like some of my team members, to, if you like, explore what those things mean and how they might be represented within the warehouse. You often find yourself dealing with what look like really trivial terms, but they're the most important things that we do. So I don't think we've got a good answer, but we've got something that works for us.
I won't even go into. I'm sure some of those conversations get a bit hairy from time to time, but let's move swiftly on from politics and let's have a think about. So what do we have to respond to those requirements then, Chris?
Okay, well, I suppose just moving on onto the next slide, which is kind of pictorially putting together what some of the words we've talked about, which is the key point about the data warehouse we just made. Technical term is sometimes called an ETL, or extract, transform, load process. Just one of the technology terms, but basically takes your operational data and provides that getting better authoritative store. It isn't, as we just talked about, a single source. It's something that evolves, but it is an area where you can ask those questions and understand deficiencies or efficiencies of that store and monitor and involve it. I've simplified the diagram to show the next stage's presentation. Of course, there's technologies in between that, like we mentioned cubes. They're somewhat just means of creating efficient exposure of data.
Sorry, what's a cube?
A cube, as I just said, it's an efficient way of presenting data.
Is it a data?
It's a
series of zeros and ones on a disk.
It's a series of ones on a disk. Yeah, it's a kind of different way of representing data in a data warehouse that more opens itself to analytical processing.
Right.
So it's another way of presenting the data. So it's more of a technology term than anything meaningful. And I've deliberately kept it off the diagram because it isn't necessarily needed for all solutions. And perhaps some people get confused with business intelligence and hear these terms of OLAP and cubes. They actually get in the way of really all you're trying to do is provide an authoritative source of data that is easy to query and responsive. That you see through your front-end tools like pivot tables in Excel, web pages where you can go on and see dashboards presented with your collaboration tools like SharePoint. And I think the trend nowadays is to move away from these terms like cubes and provide more self-provisioning type tools.
Yep.
And as you'll see in the next slide, when we talk about how you practically go forward in this sort of thing, is these tools are so powerful these days that you can actually do proof of concept approaches where you can analyze millions and millions of rows of data using common tools like Excel and Power Pivot to prove the quality of your data, to prove the concept of BI. That actually is sufficient to actually use that as a first implementation. Mm-hmm. It isn't a POC where you go away, try it out, and then present it to somebody saying, should we go ahead with this? It actually is robust enough to actually say that's the start of the process. Mm-hmm. And with the modern tools we've got these days, you can actually then use these collaborative tools, put them on something like SharePoint, provide reports off that data, and over time evolve it into a more robust, perhaps data warehouse, cube technology, if that's where it needs to go. It doesn't have to go that way. So perhaps another takeaway from here is this stepwise approach to putting BI in. Mm-hmm. It isn't give you everything from day one. You have to evolve towards where you need to go. Tackle,
so prototyping kind of,
and bring it on things, and once you've done that, move on to a next area and slowly or fastly increment your BI world and start publishing it to more and more
even
users.
A bit of an agile approach, maybe.
Definitely agile.
Can I use that term? Agile. Agile's good.
It's in the slide.
So it's
allowed.
In the slide. Fantastic.
There's a really important point here, though, and that's that particularly in the public sector, there are sort of two conflicting pressures. One's this idea of actually getting more information out of the data that's there. The other bit is that a lot of that data is actually quite sensitive. So some of it you only want to make available for reporting, perhaps in an anonymised form. Others should only be made available to very specific constituents, maybe to a particular person. Especially these days when, again, more organisations in the public sector are being asked to publish openly or make available self-service to members of the public or to their constituents at large information. So getting that security handle coupled with the whole information, what you can do with it side, again, back to the data governance that Tom mentioned, is really important and a step that has to be looked at right at the beginning there.
I've got a question come up here, which I think is relevant right now, given that we're talking about technology. When it comes to implementing BI, how does a decision support system and business intelligence complement each other? So are these just different terms for different silos, or how does it work?
I think you've got your operational data, which was the front end of it, where you deal with your day-to-day operation stuff. The BI kind of is a next layer onto that, so you're adding to it. So they work in conjunction, but they don't conflict in their roles. They're very clear. It's very clear what they should be doing. BI, I tend to say, is more summary, rolled up style of reporting, whereas operational tends to be very individual type.
Decision support system is operational data.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. Okay. So those are the sources. BI is the
summariser, the kind of looking over everything, bringing everything into an authority view. If you that's its role. So they kind of sit together. They have to work together, of course, but they don't overlap, although they shouldn't really overlap. But of course, you can use some of the BI tools to fill perhaps holes in your decision support system, or the decision support systems can actually fulfil some of the BI role.
And quite a lot of the organisations do use their spreadsheets as their decision support system of choice. That's the way people make their operational decisions. And we saw right back at the beginning that the people in the business doing the day-to-day stuff are the ones who are least well served at the moment with the more sophisticated solutions. So anything that can help those guys make better operational decisions, because they're under a lot of pressure to do so, is to be welcomed, and stuff that again we're coming to quite soon.
How important is it to capture information in the right way, which is a kind of question I've been asked, but I'm paraphrasing.
Very important, because if you don't capture it in the right way, you can't ask the right questions, and then where the intelligence come in, react in the right way. And there's no point in having graphs that say something if they have no relevance to what you do. It might be a strapline to show on a presentation, but the intelligence is all about applying what you see into some business action.
But in a lot of cases, maybe this is one for you, Tom, in a lot of cases you're going to be stuck with what you were given in the first place. So the old systems that have been around for 10 years, that's what you've got to start with.
I think that's right. But again, I come back to the way that we're moving at the minute is people are interested in the output from the corporate data repository. So I think as we move forward, we'll find that what's in the legacy system, because we generally amend it to help us handle new work or new ways of doing business, what comes out of it will be much more palatable to the corporate data repository to present something that senior colleagues are looking for. So I think very old processes, are definitely a concern in that space. Newer processes, because there's a bit more of a joined up delivery chain between the legacy system and the corporate data repository. I'm relatively optimistic that will improve as time goes on.
And something else I've found in my experience is that BI can actually extend your legacy system's life, because you can add the missing components at the BI level without going into your legacy system. So sometimes it can actually extend the lifetime of your current systems without having to rip them apart to provide whatever governance you need. It may not be true of all systems, but there is a layer. It can actually support the legacy system.
At the end of the day, it's a bunch of data. You can carry on using that bunch of data if you can then build on top of it.
That's right.
Right.
As long as it's still valuable, you use it until it's economically viable to do something else.
But let's have a look at what other kinds of challenges are faced. Maybe it's a chart, so it's one for Tony.
Dr. Stats again. We asked the readership, various questions. What are the factors inhibiting your ability to actually make more of the data that you have? And as you can see here, lack of skills and experience, and particularly training, comes up quite high on the list. We've actually split the chart into two groups here. We asked some other questions of the readership to say, how comfortable are you that you think you've got a good handle on this stuff, and how comfortable are you not? And so the guys that are really comfortable with what they're doing are the dark blue bars at the top of each of the pairs, and the lighter blue bars underneath them are the ones that are less, or who are more concerned about meeting their requirements going forward, so they're less comfortable in their capabilities to actually do that. But what we can see here is that particularly skills and lack of skills across the board is a major inhibitor, as recognised by nearly everybody, and particularly at times of saving money when there's a lot of pressure on cost. Although having said that, for the last 25-30 years it's been my experience that whenever you create budgets, one of the first things that always gets cut or wiped off is training. But to get back to it, we've seen from the earlier charts that there's a lot of capabilities that are not being exploited, and essentially the way to exploit that comes down to training. You've got to train people well enough to do the job, particularly as you're asking them to take more and more active decisions on how the business is operated day by day. That management information, that operational information that Chris just talked about and that Tom mentioned, it's something that comes in time after time, and you can't get away from the fact that training is absolutely imperative here. But beyond that, some of the other things, again, that Chris brought up, the fragmentation of data stores. That There's lots of conflicting data out there, or we don't know how to find the data, or we know where it is, but we don't actually have access to it, perhaps because it's locked up and it needs to be anonymised before we can see it. Things like that are recognised, again, as factors. The interesting thing you can see here is that there's a big difference in the size of the bars between those that think they've got a pretty good capabilities going forward and have obviously done a lot of the groundwork necessary, versus those that have still got that work to do, probably in the not too distant future. But going down again, we've got that data management, the whole governance side, big across the board issue. But then the analytics processes itself, asking the right questions, that the people know how to get hold of the data in exceptional circumstances. It comes down to the same things in IT all the time. It's about people, process, all supported by the right technology. The greatest technology on its own doesn't solve anything.
I mean, this would suggest to me, not having looked at it for very long, that the people that are good at it are good at process and seem to have a lot of better skills inside IT for a start. So,
and also we found as a collateral that they also tend to be, because they've shown the benefit of getting that information out, they find it easier to get hold of new budget to do new things, that there is another correlation there. But the ones that really have spent the time and got it worked out are better at it. But even there's still a recognition that things could be better.
Tom, from your perspective, how does this map onto where you started before you started to address some of these issues?
I think this is the slide of all the slides which probably shows the picture best of where we are.
Brilliant.
I mean, the ones that I'm interested in, I note the penultimate two, if you like, the poor analytics processes and the lack of skills, experience, or training within IT. I mean, the journey for users is quite significant, but I think the journey for IT departments as well is really significant. It's a completely different way of doing business, and certainly within my team, I don't look after IT services. Within my team, we are now having to support users out in the business in terms of how they do things as opposed to what they do. So it's very much around trying to ensure they're locked into wider developments. They've got an approach to telling us what they're doing. We have to support their need for testing and all that kind of stuff. So what IT does in a BI solution, or where you have a BI solution in place, seems to me to be somewhat different to what it might have done in the past, and we might have to let go of some things. So I think this is a really interesting slide.
And how has that gone down in terms of the old change management stuff? Have people welcomed it with open arms, or?
Well, I know that several of my team are listening to this, so I think it's probably best if I just tell it like it is. I think it's been a difficult few years just to get people to tune into the fact they need to tell us what they're doing. They need to specify requirements. They need to give people time to deliver what it is they need from the source system to help them deliver the corporate data repository aspects of this. We've, as a team, invested heavily in a liaison role to ensure that we've got a kind of business partnering role in place with that particular part of the organisation who look after the corporate data repository for us. So it's meant that we've had to develop a completely different set of skills and prioritise things in a very different way than we have in terms of what I ask my team to do.
Wait, that's quite a good segue onto the next slide. I'm going to hand over to Chris, because this is some of your distilled experience, all into a single place.
Into a single place, yes.
What you've seen across your customers.
Well, I think we've kind of reiterated some of these, which is you need time to invest. We talked about understanding your data. You have to commit to it at the whole level of training. High level, you really just have to say this is where we're going with it, and as Tom was talking about, how it changes the organisation.
Seize the nettle.
Yes.
Or the metal.
The metal. And of course the training, and so part of the new technologies allows them to be familiar with it, but ultimately there might be a brand new tool that they get into because it delivers the value. But it does mean you've got to commit to both training, both technical training and end user training. And my experience is when you deliver a solution with a friendly tool that they're used to, they take it because it solves their business problem. Also, how the technology is used. I mean, there's some very good stuff out there to make it very palatable, very easy to understand. That helps a lot to get the data across. There's masses of data being summarised, so the ability to present the data is very important. It's got to be focused data. Mm-hmm. And the last thing is the look before you leap. This is the idea of you can bring things on in a POC style of things. With cloud technologies, you can try it out without committing to hardware, so it doesn't have to be a hardware initial spend. Now, there's many ways forward in which you can get on this BI world. Mm-hmm. So I'd say the look before leap is another...
Try before you buy, look before you leap.
Sort of thing, yes.
And we've got one question here, which I think, speaking of try before you buy, what about costs? I mean, where is money going to have to be spent? Is it, if I had 100 quid, how much of that would go on training? How much of that would go on kit? How much, etc.?
It depends on obviously what the environment is, but there's no doubt that the data warehouse is an important area, and that's both time investment and ultimately may involve tin to put your data somewhere. Again,
it's going to cost more than 100 quid, isn't it? It's
going to cost more than 100 quid.
Yeah.
But if you're dealing with volumes of data, there's no pain, no gain. So that's all part about this locking into the process, understanding what it is you get delivered by using this process. It isn't going to be free, of course, but it isn't necessarily going to be throw everything out and start something new. It's getting to that stage.
I mean, can you do it on the cheap? Is there a...
You can do some of it cheaply, but
right.
Obviously if you're into the process, don't kid yourself that it is just a matter of putting a power pivot up in Excel. That is just part of the process. It goes back to, of course, what are the problems that you're having to solve? Mm-hmm. Is it somebody's worksheet you're trying to solve, or is it a big corporate web page where you need to get everybody's data out there and you've got hundreds of parents coming in? It's a case of the size of the problem you're solving would dictate.
Tom raised a really important point as well, and that's that business information and business analytics, particularly in this era when everybody's thinking about getting self-service for individuals, training of IT is really important, because if you don't train the IT guys in all these new systems, and traditionally in BI terms, IT hasn't been that involved on the training, and apart from getting the infrastructure in place and then it's handover, when you've got so much data being moved around, IT has to be an inherent part of the process. Mm-hmm. And so getting the training and the processes right there is very important, but something that it's easy for people to overlook in these days when everybody thinks that self-service is the answer to life, the universe and everything.
Tom, have you got any kind of final top tips in the last 2 minutes?
No, I think just to pick up on your cost point, John, I think that it is relatively expensive technology to put in place, and there is definitely a cost bias towards the start of the process. But as you get it established, and I'm only talking from internal experience at this point, I have no evidence to support this, it does appear that it isn't as expensive to own as it might be to initially buy. So we are seeing the costs of developments and add-ons onto our corporate data repository gradually reducing as time goes on. So I think you need to be ready for a bit of a sharp intake of breath when you first try and do this. But there might be a bit of evidence beginning to appear that the cost benefits do appear further down the road, and that these are not as costly as you might expect them to be to own.
Well, I think that is as good as any line to end on, and closes things off very nicely back to what I said originally about value being benefits minus costs. So it's about looking for the value, I suppose, rather than just focusing on trying to do stuff, or just focusing on the fact it's going to be expensive or not. If you've got any questions at all, do feel free to post them on the website. Here's some further reading for you. If anyone wants to read up some more and learn some more, I'm sure Chris would be very willing to pick up any conversations that you might want to have with him. And given that we're now on the hour, thank you very much for listening in. Hope you enjoyed that, if enjoyed is the right word. And do tune in next time. Thank you very much.